My name is Daniel Hartley. I'm 64 years old, and I still run 3 miles every single morning. I want you to remember that, because it matters to everything that happened on Thanksgiving. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer. I built bridges, real ones, the kind you drive over without thinking twice, trusting that someone like me did his job right. I retired 2 years ago, not because my body gave out and not because my mind slipped, but because I'd earned it. I had a pension, a healthy investment portfolio, and a house I'd paid off in full in Asheville, North Carolina. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a workshop in the back where I build furniture on weekday mornings. My wife, Carol, passed 6 years ago from ovarian cancer. I will not pretend that didn't break something in me permanently, but I rebuilt, slowly, carefully, the same way I'd build anything with the right materials and enough patience. My son is 38. I will not use his name here. I'll call him my son, because that relationship is the only thing that ever made him relevant to this story. His wife, I'll call her my daughter-in-law, is 35. They met at a sales conference in Atlanta 8 years ago and got married 2 years after that. I attended the wedding. I paid for a significant portion of it because my son asked, and I said yes, because that's what fathers do. In the beginning, I liked her. She was sharp, quick with a joke, and she seemed to genuinely make my son happy. I bought them a dinner set and a set of Le Creuset pots as a wedding gift. I drove 4 hours to help them move into their first house. When they had my granddaughter 3 years later, I was in the waiting room at 2 in the morning, and I cried when the nurse let me hold her for the first time. I tell you all of this so you understand what I was protecting. Not just a house, not just money. A life I had built with my own hands, and a future I had carefully arranged so that my granddaughter would have something waiting for her. I was protecting that. The first hint that something had changed came about 8 months before Thanksgiving. My son called on a Tuesday night, which was unusual. We typically talked on Sundays. He sounded tense in that particular way men sound when they're about to ask for something they know they shouldn't be asking for. We talked around it for 20 minutes. How's the weather in Asheville? How's little Sophie? Did I watch the game? Then he said, almost offhandedly, that my daughter-in-law's parents were going through a difficult time financially. I said I was sorry to hear that. He said they were looking at their options. I said I hoped things worked out for them. He paused. Then he said, Dad, they might need somewhere to stay for a little while, just temporarily. I told him I didn't have any vacation rentals to recommend, but I'd be happy to look some up. He laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. I meant here, with us. But our place only has 3 bedrooms, and Sophie's in one of them. I waited. Your house has 4 bedrooms, Dad, and it's just you. I want to be precise about what happened inside me at that moment, because I think it's important. I didn't feel angry. Not yet. I felt something quieter than anger, a kind of stillness. The way the air gets before a storm when every bird has already gone silent. I told my son I'd think about it. He thanked me. We hung up. I did think about it. For about 48 hours, I genuinely sat with the idea. Then I thought about Carol's room, which I'd kept exactly as she left it except for washing the bedding once a month. I thought about my workshop, which I used every single day. I thought about my mornings, my routines, the particular silence of a house that has learned to hold only one person's rhythms. I thought about what it would mean to have 2 strangers, because that is what my daughter-in-law's parents were to me. Strangers living inside the home where I buried my grief and rebuilt myself cell by cell. I called my son back and I told him, gently but clearly, that I wasn't going to be able to make that work. I said I was sorry for what her parents were going through. I said I hoped they found a good solution. I said I loved him. He was quiet for a moment and then said he understood. We hung up. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't the end of it. Over the next several months, the calls came differently, more frequent. My daughter-in-law started joining the calls, which she had never done before. The tone shifted. It became less, Dad, I was wondering, and more, Dad, we really need you to consider. I heard phrases I did not like. The responsible thing. Family takes care of family. You have all that space just sitting there. Every time, I listened. Every time, I said no. Every time, I kept my voice even and my reasoning clear. In September, my daughter-in-law called me alone for the first time. My son wasn't on the call. She was pleasant at first, almost performatively pleasant, the kind of pleasant that has a purpose behind it. She told me her parents were wonderful people. She told me how hard they'd worked their whole lives. She told me they were too proud to ask for help themselves, which was why she was asking on their behalf. Then her voice shifted, just slightly, still controlled, but with an edge in it that I hadn't heard before, and she told me that she'd always thought of me as a generous man, and she hoped that was still true. I told her I was the same man I'd always been. She said she hoped so. After I hung up that call, I sat in my workshop for a long time. I ran my hand along the edge of a walnut table I was building for a neighbor's anniversary gift. I thought about that edge in her voice. I thought about the fact that my son hadn't been on the call. I thought about the phrase I hoped that was still true. I'm a man who built bridges for 31 years. I know how to read a structure. I know when something is being tested for load-bearing capacity it was never designed to hold. The next morning, I called my attorney. His name is Warren, and he's been my attorney for 16 years. I told him I wanted to make sure my estate documents were completely up to date. I told him I wanted to understand all my options regarding the house. We met in his office the following Thursday and spent 2 hours going through everything. Afterward, I made several decisions. I will tell you what those decisions were, but not yet. I also, that same week, called the security company that had installed my front door camera 3 years ago after a car was broken into on my street. I asked them to come out and upgrade my system. By the end of that week, I had cameras covering the front door, the back door, the driveway, and the main living areas inside, all of them recording continuously to a cloud backup I could access from my phone. I told myself I was just being prudent. I was 64, living alone. It made sense. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving were quiet. My son and I talked on Sundays as normal. He didn't mention the housing situation. Neither did I. My daughter-in-law sent me a photo of my granddaughter in her Halloween costume. She was a bumblebee, and I saved it as my phone wallpaper. I thought maybe the whole thing had passed. I thought maybe they'd found another solution. They called 3 days before Thanksgiving to confirm I was still hosting. I said of course I was. They arrived on Thanksgiving afternoon at 2:30. My son, my daughter-in-law, and my granddaughter. I had been cooking since 8 in the morning: turkey, cornbread, stuffing, sweet potato casserole, green beans with almonds, 2 pies. The house smelled the way it had always smelled when Carol was alive on holidays. I had set the table with the good china. I had put a small vase of chrysanthemums in the center because my granddaughter had once told me she liked the ones that looked like pom-poms. The first hour was genuinely nice. My granddaughter ran to me when she came through the door, arms wide, and I picked her up even though she was 6 and not as light as she used to be, because I could and because she expected me to. We sat in the living room and caught up. My son showed me something on his phone. My daughter-in-law complimented the smell of the turkey. I poured myself a small bourbon and offered my son a beer. We sat down to eat at 4. It was halfway through dinner, somewhere between the stuffing and the pie, that my daughter-in-law said quietly, conversationally, as though she were commenting on the gravy, that her parents had found a place to rent, but the lease didn't start until February. I kept eating. She said it was going to be a hard few months for them. Hotels were expensive. I said I imagined so. My son set down his fork. He looked at me in the particular way that meant we were no longer making small talk. My daughter-in-law said her parents were good, clean, quiet people. They wouldn't be any trouble at all. It would only be a couple of months. She said it as though the decision had already been made, and we were just working out logistics. I put down my own fork then. I looked at both of them. My granddaughter was eating her sweet potatoes and not paying attention, and I was grateful for that. I told them, calmly, that I had already given this answer. I said my answer had not changed. I said I was sorry her parents were in a difficult situation, and I genuinely hoped they would be comfortable until February. But my home was my home, and I was not in a position to open it to people I barely knew. My daughter-in-law's expression shifted. Not all at once, it was a slow thing, like a sky changing color. She said she found it interesting that I could spend this much money on a house and furniture and trips and just sit on it while real family needed help. I said her parents were not my family. The table went very still. She said that was an incredibly cold thing to say. I said it was a factually accurate thing to say. My son said, "Dad, just that. One word, but with a weight in it, a warning and a disappointment, and something else I couldn't name right away." I looked at my son. I told him I loved him. I told him I respected that he wanted to support his wife and her family. I told him that was a good instinct and that Carol would have been proud of the man he'd grown into. And I told him that none of that changed my answer. My daughter-in-law stood up from the table. She said I was being completely selfish. She said she had spent years being patient with me, accommodating me, driving 4 hours to visit me so my granddaughter could know her grandfather. And this was how I chose to repay that. She said her parents were struggling, and I was sitting in a 4-bedroom house, completely alone, and acting like some kind of king who couldn't be inconvenienced. My son did not tell her to sit down. He did not tell her to lower her voice. He looked at me across the table with an expression that I want to be careful about how I describe. It was not cruel. My son is not a cruel person. But there was something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before, a kind of alignment with her that I felt in my chest, like a door closing. He said, "She's right, Dad. You have the space. We're not asking you to do this forever." I started to respond. My daughter-in-law picked up her wine glass. I want to be precise about this too, because precision matters when you're telling the truth. She did not throw the glass itself. She threw the wine, she swung the glass sharply toward me, and a full pour of red Bordeaux hit the left side of my face and my shirt in a wave. The glass stayed in her hand. The room went completely silent. My granddaughter looked up from her sweet potatoes. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up quickly or make any sudden movements. I reached for my cloth napkin, the good ones Carol had picked out from a catalog years ago, and I pressed it against my face. I could feel the wine soaking into my collar, already starting to cool. There was a small cut on my cheekbone, not deep, from where the rim of the glass had caught me on the swing. I could feel that too. I looked at my daughter-in-law. She was breathing hard, standing at the end of the table, and I could see that she'd surprised herself as much as she'd surprised me. There was a moment where I think she wanted to apologize. The moment passed. I looked at my son. He had gone pale. I looked at my granddaughter, who was looking at me with very wide eyes, and I smiled at her. I told her everything was okay. I told her Grandpa just had a little spill. I said it in the voice I used when she was small and had fallen off the swing set, and I needed her to believe that the world was still safe. Then I stood up from the table. I went to the kitchen, set the napkin in the sink, and picked up my phone from the counter. I sent a single text to Warren. It said, "Thanksgiving." She made contact. "Document everything." His response came back in under 2 minutes. "On it. Go get checked out." I walked back to the dining room doorway. I told my son that I was going to drive myself to the urgent care on Merriman Avenue. I told him that when I left, I needed them to be gone before I returned. I did not say it angrily. I said it the way I would have told a crew on a job site that a section needed to be cleared plainly, with the understanding that it would be done. My daughter-in-law said something as I walked toward the front door. I do not remember exactly what it was. Something about how I was making this into a bigger deal than it needed to be. I did not respond. I picked up my jacket from the coat rack by the door. I paused for just a moment with my hand on the door frame, and I thought about Carol. I thought about the Thanksgiving she'd had pneumonia and still made the stuffing from bed, directing me over the phone while I stood in the kitchen reading her handwritten recipe card. I thought about how much she would have hated what had just happened at her table. And I thought about what she would have told me to do. She would have told me to handle it correctly. She always said that. "Handle it correctly, Daniel. Not fast. Correctly." I drove to urgent care. The cut on my cheekbone was shallow, 3 small butterfly bandages, and a cleaning with antiseptic. The PA who treated me was a young woman who asked, professionally and without judgment, how it had happened. I told her exactly how it had happened. She noted it in her chart. I asked her for a copy of the visit documentation. She printed it for me without any hesitation. I sat in the parking lot afterward for maybe 15 minutes. The sun was going down over the mountains, and the sky was doing that thing it does in November in Asheville, all deep orange and cold blue at the same time, layers of color stacked up against the ridgeline. I have lived here for 22 years, and that view still makes me stop. I called Warren from the parking lot. He answered on the second ring. I walked him through everything that had happened, in order, the same way I would have briefed a project team factually, without embellishment. He was quiet while I talked. When I finished, he said three things. He said the medical documentation was important, and I'd done the right thing getting it. He said the camera footage from the house would be critical, and that I should not touch or alter anything. And he said that what she had done, legally speaking, was assault, and that how I chose to proceed from here was entirely my decision, but that I had options. I told him I was aware of my options. I told him we'd already discussed most of them back in September. He said he'd have everything ready. I drove home. The house was empty when I got there, as I had asked. The dining room table still had the food on it, the good china, the chrysanthemums in the center. Sophie's plate had her sweet potatoes pushed to one side, the way she always did when she thought no one was watching. My daughter-in-law's wine glass was still in her place, empty and slightly smeared. I stood in the doorway for a moment looking at all of it. Then I started clearing the table. I have cleared a lot of tables alone. You learn to move efficiently. My son called at 8:30 that evening. I let it ring. He called again at 9. I let it ring again. At 9:45, I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a yellow legal pad, and I wrote down everything that had happened in sequence, with times where I knew them. Date at the top, November 28th. I signed and dated the bottom. I made a copy on my scanner. One copy went into my fireproof safe. The other I photographed with my phone and emailed to Warren. What I did not know, what I had suspected but not confirmed until the following morning when Warren called, was that this had not been the first attempt. While I was at urgent care, Warren had been in contact with my financial institutions. Someone had attempted to access my investment brokerage account on 3 separate occasions over the prior 4 weeks. The attempts had failed because I had 2-factor authentication enabled and the security questions were answered incorrectly, twice. The third attempt had triggered an automatic lockout and a fraud alert to Warren, who was listed as my emergency contact. He had been sitting on that information, waiting. The attempted access points had come from an IP address registered to my son's home address in Charlotte. I sat with that information for a long time. I want to be careful here about what I say and what I don't say, because I believe in being accurate. I do not know with certainty who was at the keyboard on those 3 occasions. I do not know whether my son was aware of what was being attempted. What I know is what the records showed, and what Warren subsequently confirmed with the institutions. That is what I know. My son came to Asheville 4 days after Thanksgiving. He came alone. He knocked on my door at 10 in the morning, and I could see on the camera that he had driven from Charlotte that morning. There were bags under his eyes, and he'd been in the car for 4 hours. I let him in. He sat at the kitchen table and he apologized. He was sincere about it. I know my son, and I know the difference between a performed apology and a real one. He was ashamed of what had happened at Thanksgiving. He said his wife had been under enormous stress and that wasn't an excuse, and he knew it wasn't an excuse. He said he should have said something that night, should have stepped in. He said he was sorry. I thanked him for coming. I told him I accepted his apology. I meant it. Then I told him there were things I needed to say, and I needed him to hear all of them before he responded. I told him I loved him. I told him that wasn't conditional on anything that had happened or anything that might happen. I told him he was the best thing Carol and I had ever done together, and I held that truth in my chest every single day. Then I told him about the brokerage attempts. He went very still across the table from me. His face did something complicated, a series of small movements that I watched carefully, the way I used to watch concrete during a stress test. I was looking for fracture lines. He said he hadn't known. He said it in the quiet, careful way of a man who was not sure whether to believe himself. I told him that was the answer I had hoped for, and I told him that regardless of what he had or hadn't known, the situation had clarified some things for me that I needed to act on. I told him that, in September, when all of this started, I had made an appointment with Warren. I told him what we had done during that appointment. I had updated my will. I had put the house into a revocable living trust with specific succession terms. I had restructured my investment accounts with transfer on death designations and updated beneficiary assignments. I had made certain that every financial account, every asset, every document was legally situated in a way that required no access, no cooperation, and no co-signature from anyone other than me. And I told him that I had done all of this not out of anger and not out of punishment, but because I am 64 years old and I have watched what happens to people who don't protect what they've built. My son listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He asked if this meant I was cutting him out. I told him he was still in my will. He would always be in my will. My granddaughter had a trust set up in her name with enough in it for college and then some. None of that had changed. What had changed, I told him, was that I had removed every pathway, every practical, legal, and logistical pathway by which anyone could pressure me, access me, or claim any stake in my home or finances without my explicit, conscious consent. I had removed the leverage. All of it. He was quiet again. I told him that I was going to give him and his wife some time to work through their situation with her parents. I told him I genuinely hoped they found a good solution. I told him that when we were ready to rebuild our relationship, I would be here. I told him Sunday calls were still welcome. I told him photographs of my granddaughter were always welcome. And I told him that if his wife ever put her hands on me again, I would be filing charges without hesitation and without discussion. He nodded. He looked older than 38 when he did it. He asked if he could have a cup of coffee before driving back. I poured him a cup. We sat at the kitchen table and talked for 45 minutes about things that had nothing to do with any of this, about the furniture I was building, about a project he was working on, about Sophie's new obsession with dinosaurs. It was not comfortable, not exactly, but it was real. It was the kind of conversation two people have when they are choosing, deliberately and with effort, to still be something to each other. When he stood up to leave, he hugged me at the front door. I hugged him back. After I watched his car back out of the driveway, I went to my workshop. I turned on the radio, I listened to WCQS, the NPR station, and I picked up the hand plane and went back to the walnut table I'd been working on for my neighbor. The grain in walnut is particular. It changes direction unpredictably, and if you don't pay attention to it, you can tear the surface. You have to read it before every stroke. You have to be patient with what's in front of you and not try to force it to cooperate. I worked on that table for 2 hours. 3 weeks later, I received a certified letter from Warren's office. It was a copy of the formal notification that had been sent to my son and daughter-in-law. It outlined the documentation of the November 28th incident, the medical report from urgent care, the camera footage, the date-stamped written account I had prepared that evening. It stated clearly, and without hostility, that any further incidents of this nature would result in criminal charges being filed. It also contained a single paragraph, written at my request, that addressed the brokerage access attempts. It did not accuse anyone by name. It stated only that unauthorized attempts to access my financial accounts had been documented, that copies of those records had been retained, and that any further such attempts would be referred to law enforcement. Warren told me the letter was received. He told me there had been no response. I did not need a response. The letter was not a question. I want to say something here that I've been thinking about since all of this happened, because I think it's the part that actually matters. I am 64 years old. I run 3 miles every morning. I build furniture with my hands. I remember every structural calculation I've ever done, every project, every decision point. My mind is sharp. My body is strong. I live alone by choice, not by abandonment, not by accident, not because no one will have me, but because I built a life that I am genuinely content to live, and that life belongs to me. There is something that happens in this culture, a kind of automatic arithmetic that people do when they look at a man my age, living alone in a house bigger than his immediate needs. They count the bedrooms. They count the square footage. They run some kind of internal calculation, and they arrive at a number that represents what they think I should be doing differently. and then they present that calculation to me as though it overrides my own arithmetic, as though my preferences and my peace and my carefully arranged life are simply waste inefficiency to be corrected. What I want you to understand, and I say this to anyone watching who has felt this, who has had someone count your bedrooms for you, is that the square footage of your house is not a community resource. The rooms in your home are not a vacancy to be filled. Your retirement savings are not a float that your family can borrow against. What you have built is yours. You are allowed to say so. You are allowed to say so calmly, repeatedly, and without apology. And when that is not enough, you are entitled to protect it by every legal means available to you. I did not build bridges for 31 years to spend my retirement defending my right to sleep in my own home. Carol used to say that the people who love you correctly will never ask you to diminish yourself to accommodate them. She said it gently, and she said it often, and I did not always understand what she meant. I think I understand it better now. It is February. The weather in Asheville is cold and clear, the way I like it. This morning I ran my 3 miles along the River Arts District, and then I came home and made oatmeal with walnuts and dried cherries, and I sat at the kitchen table and read for an hour before going out to the workshop. The walnut table is finished. I delivered it last week, and my neighbor cried a little, which she said was embarrassing, but which I found very moving. My son and I talk on Sundays. The calls are shorter than they used to be, and more careful, the way conversations are when two people are still finding their footing. But they happen. They are real. Last Sunday, my granddaughter got on the phone and told me about a brachiosaurus, which she pronounced with complete authority, and I listened to every word. My daughter-in-law has not contacted me directly since Thanksgiving. I have not filed charges. That was a decision I made slowly, and with full awareness of what I was choosing. I decided that the documentation, the letter, and the legal restructuring accomplished what needed to be accomplished. I decided that my granddaughter did not need her father's wife to have a criminal record. I decided that I had already won the only fight that mattered, the one over whether this house, this life, this careful and quietly beloved existence would remain mine. It remains mine. There is a piece of advice I would give to anyone in a situation like this, and it is the same advice that comes from 31 years of engineering, from Warren's 16 years of counsel, and from everything Carol tried to teach me about patience and precision. Do not react in the moment. React after the moment, when you have thought clearly and documented carefully and consulted the right people. The moment when someone throws something at you, literally or figuratively, is not the moment to make your move. Your move should already be made. The groundwork should already be laid. When the crisis comes, all you need to do is stand up, press a napkin to your face, and send a text. I sent that text. The rest handled itself. A few people have asked me since this happened whether I regret hosting Thanksgiving, whether I wish I had seen it coming earlier, whether I would have done anything differently. The honest answer is no. I would not change a single thing, not even the worst of it, because the worst of it is what made everything else visible. The worst of it is what showed me exactly what I was dealing with and gave me the clarity to deal with it correctly. I sat on my porch last night, wrapped in the heavy jacket I bought in Vermont 20 years ago, watching the lights come on across the valley. It was cold enough that I could see my breath. A neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the street, and the sound carried far in the cold air. The house behind me was mine. Completely, legally, unassailably mine. The rooms were warm. The furniture was where I had put it. Carol's bedding was clean and folded. In the workshop, the wood shavings from the walnut table still curled on the floor where I hadn't yet swept them. I had a cup of tea. I watched the lights in the valley. It was a good evening.